In a quiet town nestled in the Australian countryside, Katherine Knight lived a life that seemed on the surface to be unremarkable. The streets were calm with a sense of familiarity, as if the small community had remained unchanged for decades. The air was crisp in the evenings, with the glow from the street lamps casting long shadows along the sidewalks. It was a town where people went about their daily routines without fear or concern, believing that life would continue in the same rhythm it always had. This was the backdrop to one of the most chilling true crime stories in modern Australian history. It's important to note that before the crime, Katherine Knight, a woman in her 40s, appeared to be just another quiet, unassuming member of her community. Her role at the local slaughterhouse was a matter of routine, and her colleagues saw her as hardworking, perhaps a bit quiet, but no more unusual than anyone else. To those who didn't know her intimately, Katherine seemed to blend into the landscape of the town unnoticed. But beneath this calm exterior lay the tumultuous history of a woman whose upbringing and emotional scars would eventually drive her to commit a heinous act. Katherine was born into a world steeped in violence and trauma. Her parents, both alcoholics, subjected her to an abusive environment from a young age. This history of neglect and maltreatment created a foundation for her psychological makeup, which, as we will later explore, manifested in increasingly violent and dangerous behaviors as she grew older. Her relationships were marked by manipulative tendencies and a constant need to control those around her. Though outwardly calm, Katherine harbored a deep-seated anger, an anger that seemed to be rooted in feelings of powerlessness and the need for retribution. From the outside, she lived a life that appeared to be just like any other in the small town, working her job, interacting with those around her, and quietly blending in. But as the years passed, the cracks in her facade became more apparent, eventually leading to an eruption of violence that no one could have anticipated. Katherine's case and the brutality of the crime she would eventually commit has since left an indelible mark on the community and the broader Australian public. This story is one that demands to be analyzed not simply as a crime, but as a tragic illustration of how early trauma and psychological distress can manifest in extreme and destructive ways. As the local police began to investigate, their initial findings were unsettling, but as more details emerged, it became clear that they were dealing with a case far more complex than they could have anticipated. In the early stages of the investigation, there were no immediate red flags that suggested this would be a case that would go down in history as one of the most shocking and horrific crimes in Australian criminal history. The investigation, though methodical, began to shift in tone as the true nature of Katherine Knight's psychological state became more apparent. This chapter serves as the foundation for understanding the mind of a criminal, the environment that shaped her, and the events that led up to the horrific crime. Katherine's story is not one of a monstrous villain, but of a woman whose violent tendencies, exacerbated by her painful past, escalated into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. In the weeks leading up to the brutal murder of John Price, the tension between him and Katherine Knight grew palpable. Their relationship, once perhaps ordinary in the eyes of outsiders, was far from peaceful. Katherine, who had a history of emotional and psychological instability, began to exhibit more frequent and severe signs of aggression. Her behavior, which had always been unpredictable, was spiraling out of control. At first, the violence was subtle. Katherine would often make threats, especially when she felt that John was withdrawing from her or no longer under her control. These threats, though disturbing, were dismissed as empty by those around them. However, over time, these threats escalated into more overt acts of intimidation. Katherine began to exhibit signs of possessiveness that went beyond typical jealousy. Her need to control every aspect of John's life became more apparent. John, who had already experienced her violent outbursts before, began to distance himself. He confided in his co-workers, expressing his fear that Katherine might one day harm him. Despite this, he continued to stay in the relationship, perhaps out of a sense of obligation, or perhaps due to the complex dynamics that often occur in abusive relationships. But it was clear that his fear was growing. He even sought legal advice about his safety. The first major warning sign came when Katherine viciously attacked John in their home. She stabbed him in a fit of rage, and yet after the incident, she attempted to manipulate John into thinking it was his fault. Katherine was known for playing the victim, even when she was the one instigating violence. This incident marked a turning point in the relationship. John, now visibly shaken, began taking steps to extricate himself from Katherine's grip. He even told his children that he was considering ending the relationship. But Katherine's control over him, both physically and emotionally, made that decision incredibly difficult. As the relationship continued to deteriorate, Katherine's threats became more direct and more violent. She began to talk openly about killing John, telling friends and co-workers that she would do it if he left her. The idea of losing control over him was unbearable for Katherine. Her behavior crossed from threats into actions that signaled a dangerous escalation. She stalked John, showing up uninvited at his workplace and in the neighborhoods he frequented. Her growing obsession with John's departure fueled a deadly rage within her. The timeline begins to blur at certain points, and several gaps emerge. Katherine's movements in the hours before John's death are unclear. There were reports of her being seen in the vicinity of John's house, but no one could pinpoint exactly what she was doing at certain times. There were no clear witnesses to her actions, and much of the physical evidence surrounding the murder was either destroyed or manipulated in the aftermath. The silence of the hours leading up to the crime only adds to the mystery. Psychologically, Katherine's behavior was revealing her inability to relinquish control. Her violent outbursts were no longer just reactions to anger, but seemed to be driven by a pathological need for dominance. She was unable to tolerate any loss of power, and this drive led her to commit the ultimate act of violence. The turning point came when Katherine, in a moment of delusion, seemed to believe she could literally own John's life. This was not just about punishing him for leaving her, it was about asserting her dominance over him in a way that would guarantee he could never leave again. This psychological shift is significant as it shows how Katherine's mental state had deteriorated, transforming her from a woman capable of emotional manipulation into a full-blown predator driven by a desperate need for control. At this stage, Katherine was no longer simply reacting out of jealousy or anger. She was acting on a deeply ingrained need to dominate and possess her partner at all costs. This psychological transformation reflects a deeper, more dangerous mental instability that ultimately led to the brutal act of violence that ended John Price's life. We don't know exactly when Katherine crossed the line from being angry to being a killer, but the timeline reveals an undeniable shift in her psyche, a shift that ultimately led her down a path from which there was no return. In the troubled relationship between Katherine Knight and John Price, it's important to understand the psychological toll that living with a volatile partner can have on a person. John Price, a 44-year-old man from the small town of Aberdeen in New South Wales, had lived through years of fear and emotional strain while being involved with Katherine. This chapter delves into John's psychological portrait, shedding light on his resilience, the growing realization of danger, and the profound impact of living in a toxic relationship. John Price was a hard-working, relatively quiet man who had a reputation in the community as someone who could be counted on. He was a father, a partner, and a friend to many. But behind this normal facade, he was enduring something far darker. From the start of his relationship with Katherine, John was captivated by her intensity, but it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Katherine's need for control, combined with her violent tendencies, began to take a toll on John's emotional well-being. the manipulation and threats, though not always physical, wore him down over time. Despite this, John tried to make the relationship work, possibly driven by a sense of responsibility or a misguided belief that he could change Katherine. As their relationship grew more unstable, John began to sense the danger. He started to withdraw emotionally, attempting to distance himself from Katherine's increasing volatility. His growing fear was not immediately expressed outwardly, but it manifested in small ways. John confided in his friends and co-workers, expressing his fear that Katherine could seriously hurt him if he left her. He even sought legal advice about getting a restraining order, but the prospect of confronting Katherine directly seemed too daunting. Psychologically, John was caught in a toxic cycle where he felt trapped between his fear of Katherine's wrath and his inability to escape. His behavior began to reflect this internal struggle as he continued to return to the relationship despite the escalating threats. This repeated cycle of emotional abuse is not uncommon in abusive relationships, where the victim often feels a false sense of attachment or dependency. John, for all his recognition of the danger, continued to endure the abuse, a phenomenon known as trauma bonding, where the emotional highs and lows of the relationship create an unhealthy dependency. Key insight: John's gradual awareness of the danger Katherine posed highlights the profound psychological impact of living in an abusive relationship. It suggests that fear and trauma can wear down a person's resilience over time. The emotional strain of enduring such a relationship can lead victims to a breaking point where their ability to act decisively becomes hindered. We begin to see that John's fear wasn't simply rational. It was psychological, deeply rooted in the traumatic environment Katherine had created. As we shift focus to Katherine's family and key witnesses, we start to see that her manipulative tactics extended beyond her relationship with John. Katherine had a long history of volatile relationships, and her family's perspective on her behavior is crucial in understanding her psychological profile. Katherine's mother, who was also abusive, had a significant influence on her upbringing, and this pattern of dysfunction followed Katherine throughout her life. The people around Katherine, including her family, knew about her violent tendencies, but often dismissed them as eccentricities or attributed them to her past. The investigators, too, were initially unaware of the full extent of Katherine's manipulation. They did not immediately recognize the depth of her psychological control over John, and they struggled to make sense of the chaotic relationship. However, as the investigation progressed, it became evident that Katherine was not simply a victim of circumstance. She was a calculated and methodical individual who had used violence to assert power for years. Turning point. We begin to see that Katherine's manipulative tactics were not limited to her relationship with John. She had been successful in deceiving others into thinking she was just a troubled woman, not a dangerous one. This manipulation extended beyond her relationship with John, and it suggests a sophisticated level of psychological manipulation. Katherine was able to control those around her, hiding her true nature behind a veneer of vulnerability. The focus now shifts to the final act of violence, the murder of John Price. On the night of the crime, Katherine's behavior had reached a boiling point. After a particularly violent argument, Katherine murdered John in a brutal act of violence, stabbing him multiple times. The details of the murder itself are chilling, but they are not sensationalized. Katherine's use of knives, a tool she had become intimately familiar with in her work at the slaughterhouse, was not a random choice. She used the very instrument of death to bring John under her control, a tool of both literal and symbolic power. Key insight: Katherine's final act was not impulsive. It was the culmination of months, if not years, of built-up aggression and a need for control. Her psychological breakdown was evident in the way she executed the crime. It was methodical, calculated, and deeply personal. Katherine's use of knives was symbolic of the dominance she sought to exert over John in life and in death. over his memory. This act of violence serves as the ultimate reflection of Katherine's psychological state, a woman who was no longer capable of distinguishing between love, control, and destruction. The brutal nature of the crime was not born from a single moment of rage, but from an accumulation of emotional scars and a need for power that had been festering for years. As we reflect on Katherine's final acts, it becomes clear that the violence she inflicted upon John Price was not just a random outburst. It was the tragic culmination of a lifetime of trauma manipulation and emotional devastation. This was not simply a crime of passion, it was a deliberate act driven by a need for power control and ultimately destruction. The investigation into John Price's murder was marred by numerous gaps and uncertainties elements that would later become key to understanding the true nature of Katherine Knight's involvement in the crime. As the case unfolded, it became clear that some critical details were missing, making it difficult for investigators to paint a complete picture of the events leading up to the murder. The missing data, such as unclear witness statements, a lack of surveillance footage, and gaps in the timeline, created an atmosphere of uncertainty that not only hampered the investigation, but also left psychological barriers that influenced how the case was perceived. The silence in the case speaks volumes. It's not simply the absence of evidence, it's the presence of a chilling manipulation that Katherine seemed to wield over her environment. Katherine's actions were not just violent, they were deliberate, methodical, and calculated. There were several hours leading up to the crime that remained a mystery, and the events that transpired during this time were never fully reconstructed. This lack of clarity could indicate that Katherine herself played a role in obscuring the evidence, or it could reflect the limitations of the investigative tools available at the time. In either case, these gaps in the investigation offer a psychological insight into how Katherine operated. She knew how to manipulate the narrative to create confusion and to leave the investigators grasping at straws. Key insight: the absence of clear evidence and testimony in the case may not have been purely circumstantial. Katherine's ability to control the narrative combined with the lack of reliable information suggests that the silence surrounding the case was not just an oversight. It may indicate the chilling effectiveness of Katherine's manipulation of those around her, making it more difficult for investigators to piece together the facts. Alternatively, it highlights a stark reality: the limitations of the investigative system at the time. Katherine, as a woman with a history of violence, may have been underestimated by law enforcement, and the lack of resources available for a thorough psychological profile of her at that time only compounded the issue. This gap in the investigation also raises critical questions about the psychological impact of missing or manipulated evidence. When vital parts of the case go unreported or remain unclear, the investigation's focus shifts. The police were left to make assumptions based on incomplete information, potentially reinforcing biases, or missing crucial psychological cues that could have shed light on Katherine's intentions. Were these gaps intentionally created by Katherine herself, using her manipulation skills, or did the investigative system fail to connect the dots due to a lack of resources, time, or understanding of her psychological makeup? This is one of the most troubling aspects of the case. It suggests that the system's failure to uncover the full truth wasn't merely a procedural flaw, it was a barrier to understanding the nature of the crime. In the broader cultural and legal context, it's important to consider how society views women involved in violent crimes. During the time of the investigation, female perpetrators of violence, particularly in intimate relationships, were often overlooked or downplayed. Gender stereotypes played a role in the way Katherine was perceived by both her community and law enforcement. While it was clear that she had a history of violence, the idea of a woman committing such a brutal crime as murder might have been considered too unfathomable to many. This societal bias likely influenced how seriously her behavior was taken by authorities. At the time, there was a tendency to view women as incapable of such extreme violence, especially in intimate settings. This cultural bias could have led the police to underestimate Katherine's capacity for brutality, and it certainly hindered their ability to perceive the full scope of her psychological instability. Turning point. The case, while eventually solved, might not have been a cold case if the investigators had had access to more tools, resources, and cultural understanding of the psychological factors at play. If Katherine's psychological profile had been more thoroughly understood earlier, it is possible that law enforcement could have recognized the patterns of manipulation and control that she exerted on those around her, including John Price. Instead, the case became one marked by gaps where the silence surrounding key events obscured the truth. This failure to fully comprehend Katherine's psychological state early on highlights the importance of a deeper understanding of criminal behavior and how it shapes investigations. In this chapter, we see how gaps in the investigation not only reflect the limitations of the system, but also offer insights into Katherine's ability to manipulate and control her surroundings. The investigation's failure to uncover the full scope of the crime highlights the ongoing challenges law enforcement faces when trying to understand the complex psychological makeup of perpetrators. It also suggests that even in the most well-intentioned investigations, the truth can often remain elusive, particularly when the system itself is ill-equipped to deal with the nuances of psychological manipulation and control. As time has passed since the tragic events that unfolded in Katherine Knight's case, there have been advancements in technology and forensic science that have provided some new insights into the details of the crime. DNA testing, for example, has become an indispensable tool in solving cold cases. And in Katherine's case, it was instrumental in confirming the identity of the victim and linking Katherine to the crime scene with irrefutable evidence. Blood samples, fibers, and other forensic traces allowed the authorities to create a clearer picture of the events surrounding John Price's murder. These technological advancements helped fill in some of the gaps that had previously left the case shrouded in uncertainty. However, as powerful as modern technology is, it often provides only a piece of the puzzle, not the full picture. While the DNA evidence confirmed Katherine's involvement, it did little to explain her motives. Technology can tell us who was at the crime scene, but it cannot fully illuminate why Katherine did what she did. Her psychological profile, her deep-seated need for control, her history of abuse, and her manipulative tendencies remain central to understanding the case. These aspects of Katherine's personality and her motivations are far more complex than what science and forensic evidence can offer. Key insight technology, though invaluable, cannot answer every question. While it can help verify facts and piece together timelines, the true understanding of Katherine's actions lies beyond the reach of forensic tools. Katherine's motivations, shaped by her mental illness, her past experiences, and her obsessive desire for control, are not something that can be fully explained by DNA evidence alone. The case in this respect remains as much a psychological exploration as a criminal one. Despite the breakthroughs in forensic science, there are still significant gaps in our understanding of Katherine's behavior. How much of her actions were driven by mental illness, and how much was the result of calculated, deliberate decisions? Katherine's background, filled with abuse and neglect, suggests that her actions may have been influenced by trauma. But it's unclear whether these psychological scars were the sole motivating factor behind her crime. The question of whether Katherine's actions were the result of a psychological breakdown or a calculated act of violence remains unanswered. There are also lingering questions about Katherine's family dynamics. Her mother's abusive behavior and the dysfunctional family environment she grew up in undoubtedly played a role in shaping her psychological state. However, how much of Katherine's violent tendencies were formed as a result of this upbringing and how much was driven by other factors, perhaps a deeply ingrained desire for power and control, remains elusive. We can speculate about Katherine's past, but the truth of how it influenced her actions is something we may never fully understand. The unsolvable aspects. Despite the progress made in forensic science and investigative techniques, there are still aspects of Katherine's behavior that elude explanation. How much of her violence was the product of her mental illness, and how much was the result of a deliberate desire to exert control over others? Was her crime an isolated incident driven by a moment of intense rage? Or was it the inevitable culmination of years of psychological distress and trauma? The answers to these questions remain shrouded in uncertainty. Conclusion: as we reflect on the case, it's clear that while we may never have a complete understanding of Katherine Knight's motivations, the investigation and its analysis provide important insights into the complexities of human behavior. What we know for certain is that Katherine's actions were not the result of a single factor, but rather a convergence of personal history, psychological instability, and a deeply ingrained need for control. Katherine's case reminds us that human behavior, especially in the context of crime, is often more complicated than it may first appear. The unresolved aspects of this case, the gaps in our understanding of Katherine's true motivations, are a testament to the challenges of truly comprehending the minds of those who commit such heinous acts. Key insight: the value of analyzing cases like Katherine Knight's lies not in providing definitive answers, but in deepening our understanding of the psychological factors that drive individuals to commit violent acts. The unresolved nature of this case serves as a reminder that not all questions can be answered, and sometimes the most we can do is attempt to understand the forces that shape human behavior in the most tragic of ways.